Hello, I'm Dave Reay from the University of Edinburgh, and we're just coming up to COP28, so Conference of the Parties 28, the big annual climate meeting that's in theory supposed to deliver global climate action, and in particular, deliver on the Paris climate goals. So to limit warming to well below 2 degrees with the ambition of limiting warming globally by the end of the century by 1.5 degrees. So that's the context. We're going into this 28th Conference of the Parties, COP28, which this year is in the United Arab Emirates, so in Dubai. And yeah, I'll give you a bit of a preview of my own thoughts in terms of where we're at, what we can expect, and some of the key issues to look out for in the next couple of weeks. So in terms of COP28, as ever in the run-up to these COPs, expectations have been a bit of a roller coaster and generally low. Obviously, there's a massive attention crisis globally. We've got a lot going on in terms of if you're a world leader or head of state, other than climate change to deal with. So obviously the war in Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, the cost of living crisis around the world, still trying to recover from COVID, all these things taking attention away from arguably, and I'd say the biggest challenge this century and beyond for our species, which is climate change. So this COP is really important just in terms of maintaining that attention. It's also probably the most important COP since Paris. So we know that the Paris Climate Agreement is really the focus for global action, and I talked about those targets. This COP is really important because it is the first global stock take. So you'll hear that phrase bandied around a while. So one of the things the Paris Agreement did, which was really powerful potentially and certainly very much needed, was to say, okay, as part of this climate negotiation process, we need a regular stock take of how we're doing. How close are the cuts that we're making and the committed future cuts? How close are they to aligning us with the Paris climate goals? So the global stock take has been happening over the last year or more and reported before COP. So we know what the global stock take outcome was. And the key outcome was that there's a big gap between what nations of the world are doing and committed to do and what they need to do to deliver on the Paris climate goals. So that global stock take is really important in terms of saying, look, guys, we're not doing enough, nowhere near enough. But also what it then leads to is a ratchet mechanism, essentially, is to say, right, this is the gap that we need to fill. And so this is where we need to up the ante in terms of what we as nations around the world are committing to do to tackle climate change. So this is a big one. They're all big, I guess, but yeah, this is a major one in terms of how the world reacts to that global stock take and the reality that we're far away from where we need to be on emissions reductions, on financing action, and on adapting to climate change. A lot of the context for this COP you will have probably already seen in the media. So expectations were raised a couple of weeks ago when the world's two biggest emitters, US and China, met in terms of talking about climate change. So they published a thing called the Sunny Lands outcome, which was basically their discussions around how those two major nations can work together on climate, even though obviously they don't see eye to eye on quite a few other issues. So that was really encouraging, just in terms of some of the common text and the fact that they lead many other countries to kind of to test the water. They're a bit of a kind of litmus test for how things will go at the COP. So a good US-China relationship on climate is a real reason for some optimism going into the COP. The other thing that's been in the news a lot, though, is the fact that this COP is in an oil-producing nation, the United Arab Emirates, and the president of the COP is the head of the national oil company. So that is something which is obviously causing a lot of concern in terms of whether this COP will be all about protecting oil and gas interests over taking the sustained climate action which is needed. You'll hear loads more about that in the coming weeks, I'm sure. but I wanted to flag up some of the things we can look for in terms of the negotiations, and particularly at the end of the COP, what kind of things we would hope to see. So a key basis for that, I talked about this global stock take. So what we'll see at the end of this COP is a response to that global stock take in terms of what the nations of the world agree to in terms of action. So collective action, but importantly within that, what they are going to do as individual nations, because they have to get this through their own parliaments at home and actually make it stick. So what we'll see, I suspect, is some significant commitments globally to increasing renewable energy capacity. We know that decarbonising our economies around the world, a lot of that is going to depend on clean electricity. So that is how we're going to get a long way towards the Paris climate goals. And so one of the key goals which the US and others are looking to agree at COP, or certainly get a lot of nations behind them on, is this goal of tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030. That's a huge amount of extra wind and solar in particular, some hydro and other renewable energy technologies in there, but solar's, you know, going to have to expand massively to meet that target. Wind, likewise, big increases in capacity are needed. And that has kind of two roles. So one of the roles is to substitute for the energy that we currently source at the moment from fossil fuels. So about half of that extra renewable energy, that huge amount of renewable energy capacity we need by 2030, that will be substituting for energy at the moment that we source through fossil fuels. The other half is really for the expansion in demand and the expansion in the way we are using in terms of decarbonising our societies, using electricity rather than other forms of energy to give us power. So yeah, a really big ask there. It's possible though, it's feasible, but it does need obviously huge investment. It needs that nation by nation and place-based approach in terms of what renewables work where, how are they connected, how you provide the base load as it's called. So if it's not windy and it's not sunny, where does the energy come from to keep the lights on? How do you share energy between countries? Have we got the grid connections and the kind of infrastructure to provide it? All of those things are hugely important, but ultimately, if we can get that triple renewable energy capacity target by 2030, if that can be realized, that will go a long way towards the Paris climate goals. Aligned to that, very, very much linked, and you'll probably see quite a lot of this target as well, is this idea of doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvements. So that's basically how much growth we get or productivity, how much money or unit of output, however you measure it, you get per unit of energy you put in. And that energy efficiency rating has been increasing steadily for many years now. But the idea is to go from the current rate, which is a 2% each year, it gets 2% better in terms of energy efficiency, to double that by 2030 to 4% a year. And that will have huge benefits in terms of essentially just how much energy we need to produce globally in the first place to decarbonize our economies. But it's actually very linked to the first one, because if we've got much more renewable energy and we're switching to things like here in cold countries, heat pumps for our heating, or we're going for electric cars over internal combustion engines, so those using petrol or diesel, that actually in itself provides a big step up in terms of energy efficiency for the transport sector and the heating sector for buildings. So they're very much linked together. You really struggle to do one without the other. And so they're both feasible, but again, you need huge commitment in terms of that renewable energy expansion, as well as the energy efficiency improvements in terms of not just things like heat pumps and electric cars, but how we insulate our buildings, how we make them resilient to higher temperatures, so how air conditioning is used, etc. But those two together, they can go a long way in terms of the energy side of the equation and meeting the Paris climate goals. The other one I wanted to mention, because this is dear to my heart, is methane. So if you've been looking at some of the news around kind of climate change commitments over the years, you will have noticed that there's been a kind of a group pushing for reducing methane emissions under something called the Global Methane Pledge. And that's something which attracted quite a few nations have got on board with that. And the idea is to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. Why that's really important is that methane is a really powerful greenhouse gas. If we go back to kind of human history and we look at the warming due to human activities, then around 30% of it is down to this powerful greenhouse gas methane. I'm going to do another presentation, particularly on methane, because I love the gas so much. You can talk for days about it, but just to flag up some key facets of it. So a lot of the methane that's emitted around the world comes from fossil fuel, particularly the extraction of fossil fuels like coal. It also comes from livestock agriculture and from things like rice cultivation and waste management. So it's quite tricky to limit because it's got all these different sources, but because it's a really powerful greenhouse gas and it has a relatively short lifetime in our atmosphere, only kind of 10 to 12 years, if we slash emissions of methane, then we can have quite a quick impact in terms of warming effects. We also get this big benefit that methane is a real contributor to poor air quality. So it has a real role in a thing called low-level ozone. So basically really bad air quality that you often get in cities. More methane tends to contribute to worse air quality. So there's some big human health benefits from cutting methane as well. Like I say, I'm going to talk more about methane in depth and how we cut it in another talk. But basically that global methane pledge, a key part of it will be getting more nations on board. So some of the big emitters, China's the biggest methane emitter globally, having them on board with it, other big nations like India, hopefully getting a critical mass in terms of the big methane emitters, reporting what their emissions are and then cutting those emissions. That will be a really positive outcome of COP28. The final thing I wanted to mention is something that's dear to the hearts of many of us in Scotland, and something that Scotland's played a key role in discussions around is loss and damage, and particularly a loss and damage fund. So you might remember from the Egypt COP, which was COP27 last year, there was an agreement to create a loss and damage fund. So this is basically nations putting in money with the recognition that even if we cut emissions, which is mitigation, even if we adapt to the impacts of climate change, which is building higher seawalls or changing our crops to be more resilient, actually the impacts of climate change are already being felt. There is some loss and damage already occurring that can't be mitigated or adapted away. So the idea of the loss and damage fund is to recognise that, but put money where the mouth is, in terms of those nations most responsible, so particularly the rich countries, the high emitting countries, so that people, communities around the world, their livelihoods can be, in theory, helped in terms of this loss and damage fund. It's been controversial, partly because of the time it's taken. This has been very long running, the discussions on this, and a lot of the rich countries don't want it to be seen as kind of reparations, so a kind of blank check for the damage their emissions and their historical emissions are doing around the world. It's now, though, taking shape in terms of there will be a fund. A lot of the argument around now is about how it will be managed. Will it be the World Bank who are responsible for getting the money and distributing it? So a lot of concern around essentially it being a sewn up deal in terms of the rich countries. There's also a lot of debate about who puts money into the loss and damage fund. Most countries now have people, in fact every country thinking of it, has people who could justifiably claim that they are experiencing loss and damage from climate change. So one of the pushes, for instance, is for China, who is obviously a big economy now and has come from the developing world context, calls for that they should actually input to the loss and damage fund. So we'll see what the size of the prize is, and it won't be anywhere near what it needs to be, but there should be some more commitment from groups like the European Union in terms of funds for this. The Scottish government has already put money into the loss and damage fund. We'll see other nations like the UK probably committing to investment through the loss and damage fund. watch out for those commitments in terms of, are they new money or are they rebadging commitments that governments have already made, which is always a key question to ask when you see these new funds. So in terms of a wish list for COP28, well, really, ultimately, it needs to be something which gets us closer to the Paris climate goals, remembering that at the moment we're on track for something like 3 degrees of warming globally by the end of the century, and we need to get that down to 2 and actually well below 2, so towards 1.5. One of the slogans we'll hopefully hear at the end of this COP, certainly at the beginning of it, is that we need to keep 1.5 alive. If this COP can deliver the tripling in renewable energy capacity, the doubling in the rate of energy efficiency improvements, a really substantive loss and damage fund, and something really international in terms of the global methane pledge, then that will help. That will get us closer. One of the things this COP will hopefully do is focus the minds of our leaders across the world in terms of their nationally determined contributions. This is basically what each nation then commits to do in terms of their emission reductions. And we're coming up for a round of new nationally determined contributions from all of the countries in 2025. So between this COP and 2025, based on the global stocktake, what we need to see is all of those nationally determined contributions, when we add them up, to move us massively closer to 1.5 degrees in terms of warming by the end of the century. So I said this COP was really important. It is just so crucial because given everything else that is going on, there's a real risk that things are kicked down the line, that we don't see real strong progress in terms of that global commitment on climate change, but also the national commitments. But if we have a really strong global outcome from COP28, and we have that commitment for things like tripling renewable energy capacity, then that will flow down into those national determined contributions from each nation to say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to expand our renewable energy generation and phase out fossil fuels. So as ever, expectation is a roller coaster, but yeah, this really needs to be a good COP. So fingers crossed.